Hello and welcome back to my channel. If this is your first time here, hi, I'm Cassidy. If it's not, thanks for always tuning into my videos. You know, Valentine's Day is around the corner, and so I figured I should do some sort of Valentine's Day inspired video. Today's video is a recommendation for any of you romance girls. Anyone who reads romance but is wanting to get into fantasy. And I'm not meaning like romance fantasy, I mean like if you are wanting to read epic fantasy, high fantasy, if you are wanting to one day get to those books. I think that these are great books to transition you into the stories that I love. Honestly, I love most of these. So these are high fantasies, epic fantasies that have romance as a plot line within them. They are not the main plot line. They are not fantasy romance. They are not A Court of Thorns and Roses. They are not From Blood and Ash, because those are fantasy romances. Those are fantasies where romance is the main point of the story. These are stories where things happen elsewhere. The plot is not about our protagonist romance, but the romance is essential to the plot line and to the characters and how you feel throughout the story. I think having romance makes a book tend to be accessible to a lot of audiences. I think that's why a lot of YA has romance, because it just gives you something to root for within everything else that's happening within the story. I tend to not like romance in my stories, especially epic fantasy, but when it's done well, it's done well, and I think that these are all incredible stories. I actually think that most of these are favorites on this list, so I'm excited to dive right into it, and I broke out my romance cup. The easiest place to start on this list is YA. I will transition you from YA to things I call new adult to adult, and it'll be like a slow progression. Wherever you are in the journey, then you can start. Whether you're still reading YA fantasy, there'll be places for you. Whether you no longer want YA and you just want the new adult to adult stuff, there's things for you. The first one I'm going to start with is probably the one that I would call the most 2012 YA, and a lot of people read it back then, but I didn't. I actually read it as an adult, and I loved this series. And it is the Red Queen Quartet by Victoria Aveyard. This follows Mare Barrow, whose world is divided by blood. Either you have silver blood or red blood. If you have red blood, you are just like a regular civilian, you're kind of just like, so the men are sent to the army to be soldiers. Like, think about your lowest class in society. And if you have silver blood, it means that you are the royal line and you have magical abilities. But something happens one day when Mare realizes that her blood is not all that it seems. And we get rebellions, lots of politics, and there is a romance in here that spans all 4 of the books, and it is a romance that you root for. I think you root for. I mean, I rooted a different way, but that's because my heart is black and cruel. But it is one of the only YAs I still think about reading. I loved it. It is one of the only ones that still sits on my shelf, because I absolutely adored the series, and I can't tell you why, but I think that the magic system in this is very tangible to what an epic fantasy, an adult fantasy magic system could be, but there is a romance storyline to like really get you through it. And I mean, the characters in this, love them or hate them, you feel passionately about them, and that's something I loved about this series. The next is the Ember and the Ashes Quartet by Sabaa Tahir. I also read this as an adult. I didn't read it that long ago. I think like 2 years ago I read this, and I really liked this one. This is a military fantasy set in the Middle East. It is full of the lore and mythology of the Middle East. So think the Jinn and the Devas, and just like a beautiful, beautiful magic system based on myth and lore of a beautiful culture. This one, we follow our 2 protagonists. We follow a girl and a guy, so like, I mean, romance. It's a YA fantasy. I don't think it's a spoiler to say. I mean, if it is, you're coming here to know these books have romance, so I mean, you know quite early on what is going to happen. And we're following this world where there was a war at some point, and now we have the ruling martial state. And Elias is a soldier for this state, and he wears a mask, and he essentially kills all of Laia's people. When Laia's brother is taken for treason, she ends up joining the, the rebellion. She joins the rebels, and she ends up going as a slave to the martial camp, and from there she has to like get secrets because she's a spy for the rebels and all of this other stuff, and there's a bunch of tragedies that happen, and she meets Elias, and neither is free, and it's like a story of them kind of figuring who they are. It's YA, and like YA stories are coming of age stories, and I think that it was a really fun setting to see people come about. I don't own the next one. It's actually technically sci-fi, but I think that sci-fi and fantasy aren't that far apart, and if you end up liking some of the like epic sci-fis, then fantasy ends up being an easy transition. But I do think sci-fi tends to be easier to grasp as it does happen in our world most of the time, and with elements that are more tangible to the human brain if you are more of a literal person. And so the next one is the Scythe trilogy by Neil Shusterman. This one follows a world where people can't die anymore. Like old age, disease, all of that has just been eradicated. If you hurt yourself, you can be healed. Like, it's just, people do not die. But obviously overpopulation is still a thing. We can't have too many people on our planet that can't die. Like, you can't just, our planet cannot handle just like an ever-growing amount of people. We do need a balance somewhere. So they have these things called scythes, and they are people that are trained to kill people. They have really no ruling law. They just get to go around and kill people. And it sounds like very terrible. And it is terrible. But like the way it's done in this story feels very real and raw. And I really, really enjoyed the style of this story and the world that we have. It is a utopian, which is a word I don't think is often described. It's essentially dystopia, but like, it's not bad. Like, dystopia, essentially, like, the end of the world is, like, crumbling, where utopia is that it's, like, all flowers and roses. But utopia and dystopia tend to mirror each other very well. There is a romance in this one. Obviously, it's why it's in this video. I need to stop telling you that. And it is between teenagers again, and it's very, like, wholesome, I think. To get us out of the YA world, this one is technically classified as YA some places and adult other places. So we have the Mirror Visitor Quartet by Christelle DeBow. This used to be one of my favorite series. The second book is one of my favorite murder mystery plots ever, but this one is following a world full of arcs. Our world essentially has been separated into these things called arcs, and each arc has like a family spirit on it that grants that arc a special power based on the family spirit's special power. We follow Ophelia, who is from Anima, and Ophelia has two special powers. She can touch an object and read that object, which is like seeing all the history of it, of people who have touched it and things like that. And then she can also travel through mirrors. And she gets put into an arranged marriage from this family spirit, because the family spirits are like God. They're like all willing, their word is law, to Thorn, who is from the pole. And we don't know Thorn's magical power starting the story, so I'm not going to tell you it. But the pole is like something that Ophelia has never seen before, where Anima is like calm and about research and learning. The pole is about politics and scheming, and it's cold, and we have this building that like changes floors, and we have all these people that are just like using Ophelia as a pawn. And also Ophelia during this one has to be a man. She has to dress up as a man because being who she was would cause her too much harm on this. I feel like I phrased that really weirdly. She was just in danger as who she is, so she pretends to be someone else. And I think you get to see a lot more of the politics and the structure of the world because of that, and I really, really enjoyed it. And I think that this is a really unique series, and it's crafted really beautifully. So those were my YA recommendations. I think that this one does border YA. It could be YA. I think it probably classifies as new adult. In some places it is just YA, so I put it under YA, but it does have a little bit of an older feel to me than like the Red Queen Quartet. But I have two that are classified as adult, but I think personally to me read as new adult. And I'm making new adult a category that I use on this channel. New adult is books that are meant for readers who are not quite done YA, and not saying adults can read YA, okay? So like, I'm not saying that adults can't, but I think that these are probably from 18 to 28 is their like target audience for these stories, because they do read a little bit more younger. They have a little bit more younger themes to them, but they also have the conversations and discussions that we have in adult books. And our protagonists tend to be younger in these as well. Not saying that a young protagonist makes a book YA, because I read plenty of books that have young protagonists that are like 13, 14 and are adult for sure, but it is an adding factor to these and where I'm putting them. And you can argue with me and just call them adults, because new adult is not actually a thing, because they are technically adult. But I think for the purpose of this video and for the purpose of showing people a linear scale, it makes sense to have it be new adult. And I'm probably over-explaining myself to all of you. The first one I have here is the Burning Blade and Silver Eye trilogy by Django Wexler. I feel like no one knows that title. It starts with Ashes of the Sun. I recently read this and absolutely adored this series. This one, we are following two siblings, and so it's kind of cool because you have the two protagonists, but unlike with YA books where you have a female and a male that you automatically know are going to fall in love, in this story, they're brother and sister, so they don't. So within the story, we're following Maya and Geyer, who are brother and sister who were separated when they were young. When Maya is like 5 years old, the Empire comes and takes her away because she has some kind of power and some kind of sickness, and then she grows up and she works for the Empire. Geyer was hurt the day his sister was taken away, and he ends up working for the rebellion. He ends up building an empire himself to take down the Empire. And I love a brother-sister on opposite sides of the revolution, and I think that itself, the family bonds in this make it accessible. But each character has its own romance subplot within all 3 books in this series, and I don't often like romance. I've said this before, and I rooted for all of the romance in these stories. Anyways, I loved this series, and I think it has a really cool magic system. And although, like, slightly complicated, I still think really beginner-friendly because of the way it is explained and the way you learn about it. The next one I'm going to classify as new adult. Some people are probably going to come for me for, but it's okay. It is the Daevabad trilogy. I don't own book 1. It was lent out to a friend and never came back to me, so I'm holding up the second book. But the first book is City of Brass by S.A. Chakraborty. This is a beautiful, beautiful story. The Daevabad trilogy is one of my all-time favorites. It is top tier, and it is also one of the stories I recommend to almost anyone who wants to get into fantasy, regardless of whether you are a romance reader or not. I just think it's a beautiful, beautiful story, and I don't know a lot of people who disliked it. Now I'm gonna get comments saying, like, I disliked it. I just am saying, like, a lot of people love it. In this story, we are following 2 protagonists, Nari and Ali. And Nari is a regular human, and she lives in, I think, 18th century Cairo. Technically, this is low fantasy. It is set in our world. Daevabad is rich and full of, like, feels like a whole other world, but technically the actual story is set on Earth, which I think also makes it kind of accessible. But Nari is just a regular human, and she is making her money pickpocketing and thieving people and doing all of this. She pretends that she has like this magical ability to like heal people and do all that, and one day she accidentally summons a djinn. She doesn't realize what she's doing, and then because she used real magic, other things are after her, and this djinn has to protect her because he realizes that Nari is the last of the ruling line of Daevabad. Our second protagonist, Ali, is a member of the Daevabad city. He is the second son to the current king of Daevabad, but the current king is not like the people who are supposed to be ruling. That would be Nari's bloodline. And in Ali's POV, we see a lot of the politics of Daevabad. I think a lot of readers prefer Nari, which is 100% fair, but I do think that Ali's POV is just something beautiful as well, and you just see so much of the world that is Daevabad and this golden city within it. And of course, like every other book in this, there is a romance, and I really, really adore this series, and this is always my recommendation for people to pick up who want to get into fantasy, and because it has romance, I think it's very accessible as well to be rooting for. And the last 2, which are adults on this list, are by the same author, and an author I feel like we all know and hear a lot about on BookTube, but like, you hear about him for a reason, And it is because his books are just so accessible, the way they're written, between the wording that he uses, between being able to like self-insert you into his books, and things that he uses, such as romance as part of the story, to help the regular reader, the regular audience, also be able to indulge in his stories. Let's just get right into it. And it is Brandon Sanderson. And the first one I'm going to talk to you about is Elantris, which is my personal favorite Sanderson, but one of the least favorites, I feel like, within the Sanderson stans and the Sanderson fans. This was the first Brandon Sanderson I picked up, and I do think it is very different than anything else he writes, which is why it gets a lot of hate. But we are following the city of Elantris and the cities around Elantris. We're following 3 protagonists in this, 2 of which that had an arranged marriage but never got to meet. And this is like what I think is beautiful about this, is because I do think that there's a romance and I'm rooting for these 2 characters, but like they were in arranged marriage and never met. So like the romance is different than I think what people expect in a romance, but I think that you'll be like with me and rooting for these 2 characters a lot, because Prince Roedin ends up getting the sickness, I think it's what it's called. It's been a long time since I read this. The Shade, I think is what it's called. And it comes mysteriously, and it's like a sickness or a curse where anything that happens to your body stays forever. So if you stub your toe will be stubbed forever and you'll feel that pain forever. There is no healing. And so the night before he's supposed to meet his new future wife, he gets the Shade and he's thrown into the city of Elantris, which is where their gods used to rule, but they are now what they think has created the Shade was the gods that are no longer there. So they throw anyone that gets the Shade into there because they think that it'll infect other people. So we follow Prince Roedin within Elantris, and then we follow Siobhan, I think is her name, who is his wife-to-be that is now a widow because essentially they think that he's dead. And then we also follow a religious zealot. And I just thought that this book was really well crafted, and I love the politics in it. And it's a standalone, and it's not super long, and so it's beautiful, and I do think it is a great place to start, and does have a bit of a romance. It's not, I think the farther you get into this list, the less the romance is like a key part. The YA will have romance be very heavy at the forefront, and the adult will have it kind of be more background stuff, but it is there. And then the other one I'm going to recommend is The Final Empire, the Mistborn trilogy by Brandon Sanderson. I feel like this is recommended everywhere for beginner fantasy, and I do just think there's a reason it is. The Mistborn world is this world where you can ingest, some people can use the power of metal, and what they can is they can ingest a metal and then use it as power, and there are like rules and restrictions to each metal. Each metal is a different power. Most people can only use one metal. They only have like an affinity for one metal, but then there are these people called Mistborn that can use all 5. We follow Vin, who is a peasant on the streets. She is pickpocketing to stay alive. She is that low class, and she somehow ends up attached to a group that is going to do a heist to overthrow the empire. And the first book in the series is my personal favorite, but I feel like that's a very unpopular opinion. But there is a romance that happens within the series as a whole. I don't remember if it really is within book 1, but as the series as a whole, there is a romance. And I do think that this is just so accessible. So that's why it's on this list. I'm sorry that my adult ones were both Sanderson, but I really struggled. I did have the Chorus of Dragons on this for a bit because there is romance within this that I love, but I don't know if it's meant for romance readers that are getting into fantasy, but if you are a already fantasy reader and you're looking for some sort of romance in your book, I would try this one. I forgot one. Well, that's good, because I do have one more for adult. The last one for the adult one is the Winnowing Flame trilogy by Jen Williams. I read this last year, and I loved it. And there is a romance. It is a brooding romance within this one. And the Ninth Reign series follows a world where aliens used to come and like try to destroy the planet, but these vampires and their beasts would fight them off. And something happened in the last reign, the 8th reign. They call them reigns because the aliens like rain down. And the aliens have yet to come back, but the vampires are also now dying off because their tree is dying and they don't really know how it's happening and blah, blah, blah. There's a whole bunch of history in that, and it's really good, and you should read the book for that. And now what's going to happen when the aliens come back for the 9th reign? Because we no longer have vampires and their beasts to defend humanity, and we're weak and meek and can't defend ourselves. I really liked this trilogy. It was a lot of fun, and the second book has my favorite animal companions, but there is like a brooding romance in it that I really enjoyed. Actually, there's a couple romances in the series that I really enjoyed. Anyways, thank you so much for watching this video. I hope that maybe you got some new inspiration for some books to read, and maybe you will try to dive into some fantasy. I will say everything on this list I think is very beginner friendly, and you could also just call this a beginner fantasy video, but the idea was they all had romance subplots, so there are other things that I would put into a beginner video that aren't here because they don't have that romance subplot, but all of these do. And I'm just over-explaining things today. Anyways, thank you so much for hanging out with me today, and if you're feeling chatty, let's discuss a book that you like that has a romance subplot in the comments. And if you're not feeling chatty, leave me some kind of heart emoji. I'm thinking like the heart, there's a heart with like an arrow through it. Leave me that one. And then if you'd like to connect with me on other platforms, my Bookstagram, my Book Twitter, my Goodreads, and my Patreon, all linked in the description bar below. Have yourselves an absolutely fantastic day.